Welcome back to the second part of the theory and history of writing. And again, my apologies as you hear me shuffling through my books. I want today to pick up with Walter Ong and review some of the larger concepts that undergird the thinking in what we've read for this class. This is actually Ong's most famous book and his greatest statement, the orality and literacy, the technologizing of the word. It really put him on the map in some very important ways. And he actually introduced, sort of validated the use of oral tradition and an understanding of how orality functions differently from literacy, but not in a less important way. So he is then, if you remember what we were talking about from last time, just very briefly, he insists that all forms of writing include an oral component. That when we write, we never lose orality. That's a mythical belief. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about the differences between orality and literacy as he understands them. So if we begin, just remember that his primary claim, or one of the primary claims in this book, again, is that writing never dispenses with orality. And I want you to hang on to that idea because when we get to the last few weeks of this course, when we discuss modern technologies, I want to try to argue, and you might disagree by that point, but I want to try to argue that we're returning the new forms of media that we use to communicate today, and specifically that we use for writing, for ways that we put words into space, as per Ong's definition, require more explicit use of, or rather more reflective understanding of the oral component of what it is that we're writing. So more simply put, we're returning, I think, to pay really careful attention or to pay some kind of attention to the oral components, the oral features of what we're writing. What I mean by that will become more clear when we get to the end of the course, but keep that idea in mind, that writing never dispenses with orality, as Ong puts it. So if we begin just to talk about these terms, the differences between orality and literacy, keep in mind that Ong's primary function or primary purpose in his book is to explain the differences, as he says, in mentalities. This is on page 4 in his introduction, between oral and written cultures, or rather oral and writing cultures. So differences in mentality. To put this another way, we would say different psychologies, different ways that the mind works in the world, and therefore different ways that we understand ourselves as existing in that world. So we'll talk about what this means. First, a couple of definitions. These would be on page 11 in the book. Let's see if I have the right page. Page 11. Here is where Ong, for the first time, fully defines what he means by orality and literacy. And he breaks orality down into two kinds. First, as he says in the second paragraph, orality of a culture, the orality of a culture totally untouched by any knowledge of writing or print is primary orality. So a culture in which that has never been introduced to writing. This does not mean that many individuals within a culture could not be illiterate. That is to say, we could live in a society within a culture in which many people are illiterate. And many people in the ancient world were illiterate, yet they created our first writing systems. The point is, when you live in a literate culture, you're aware of writing. We discussed this last time briefly. And a great example is when you walk down a street in Japan, in Tokyo, in the center of Tokyo. This is a heavily, heavily literate culture. Writing is everywhere in large, brightly lit letters, and the letters are gigantic, the signs are huge. And if you cannot read or write those signs, or are capable of writing those signs, that does not mean that you don't understand what the writings is and what its function is, and that it does something important in shaping your world. So if you live in a primarily oral culture, you've never been exposed to that sense. You have no idea that there is a way of putting the word that we speak into space. Again, per Ong's definition. There's no way to put that word into space. So this is an entirely different way of understanding the world. A world of secondary orality is in some way what many of us live in. He defines this as the secondary orality of present-day high-technology culture, in which a new orality is sustained by telephone, radio, television, and other electronic devices that depend for their existence and functioning on writing and print. Notice that he doesn't talk much about computers in this book. He doesn't talk, because this was written in 1982. Computers were on the rise and certainly in use, but they were not ubiquitous the way that they are today. So secondary orality is the kind of orality that is sustained within a written culture, whether we're necessarily reflective about that or not. And what I was suggesting earlier is that I think there's a need for us to become more reflective and to be able to understand the oral features of the writing media that we use today. We'll get back to that in the last 2 weeks of the course. But secondary orality, we speak on the television, we hear words on the radio, we almost hear and watch words on television, but all of these depend for their existence. These forms of speaking depend for their existence on the writing. So writing preceded this speaking. You could think of this another way, that a speech could depend on a written form, a speechwriter. There could have been a text before. What Ong would say, however, even though that's true, if you saw Bill Clinton's speech at the Democratic National Convention this year, that was a brilliantly delivered speech, and it was a performance. It was an oral performance. In fact, if you transcribed what he said, it was quite different from the original written version of that speech. So Clinton added back in, or was heavily relying on, oral features of presentation, of the presentation of that writing in a certain way. So here again, secondary orality is a kind of new orality that has been that exists within a culture and among individuals who are aware of writing, who know what writing is, who do not necessarily read and write themselves, although more people do now than they did in the ancient world, but that understands that writing exists and understands what it does, and understands in some ways, maybe not every individual again, but that the culture understands that much of what we say depends on what we write. So that's the claim there. We're going to look a little bit ahead to now discuss the differences in mentality, the different kinds of states of mind and ways of thinking that are apparent in an oral culture as opposed to a literate culture, or what he calls a chirographic culture. He uses that word, those are synonyms, but he'll use the word chirographic quite often. So if we look to the last pages, and I'm just sort of skimming through some psychodynamics of orality, roughly around page 70 till the end of that chapter, we have a good sort of summary, in a sense, of the features of orality. And Ong makes points similar to the points that we made in the last lecture, that orality is temporal. It's not spatial, and it's temporal, and it exists only for a certain amount of time. And we can't go back to that time, and we lose the sound the moment that we say it, that we utter a sound. So as he says, sound exists only when it is going out of existence. Gnadsky makes a similar claim in the introduction to her book. So the idea that orality is temporal and is effervescent and is not something that we put permanently into space or render spatial, make into an object, is a feature of orality. And the primary feature of sound is that, as Ong says, it incorporates. Sound is not something that is broken up into bits. We don't experience it that way. It incorporates, whereas, as he says, sight, the primary sense that we use when writing, when creating an object and putting it into space, dissects. So sound incorporates and vision dissects. So he says here, when we're hearing a sound, or when we're experiencing sound, we experience it from all around us at one time. It's simultaneous in a certain sense. And we have a sense of harmony. We don't hear different pieces, we hear one continuous sense of sound. So the feature that defines oral culture, or that because it's defined by sound, by the sounds that we produce in order to communicate, is harmony. Harmony, a putting together. So there's this kind of continuity of experience, this continuity of communication, of movement, and this is how the mind works, according to Ong, within the terms of orality. If we contrast this with the features of a literate economy, we have to begin by thinking of the primary sense that's required of literacy, according to Ong, which is, again, as we stated, vision. Vision is not continuous and vision is not harmonious. Vision both dissects and is, by definition, a dissecting sense, in the sense that, as he says on here in my book, page 72, vision comes to a human being from one direction at a time. One direction at a time. To look at a room or a landscape, I must move my eyes around from one part to another. And that's a great, perfect example. We can't experience a room visually as a whole. Now, we can certainly step back and get a larger sense of that room, but we're still getting necessarily a perspective which is derived from the word sight, and it's to see toward, is to have a particular view of something. It's necessarily a partial seeing or a partial view. So vision, the primary sense required for writing and for making words and putting words into space as objects, and to make them objects that are permanent and can be passed on to someone else, dissects and is necessarily singular. It can't do everything. It can't take in a whole. So this is what this feature of literacy, which contrasts with the harmony of orality, this dissecting feature of literacy, leads, according to Ong, and Havelock will say this later, we're reading him next in the next few weeks, that leads to the development of a different kind of thinking, what he calls analytical thinking, a kind of thinking that can piece thoughts out, that can put down on paper pieces of larger chains of cause and effect, larger sequential connections among ideas and so on, that are not simply aggregative, that don't simply add to one another in a kind of continuous and harmonious and sort of coordinated way, with a sense of and. We'll get into this more. We haven't read all of Ong's chapter on the psychodynamics of orality. We're going to be returning to this. But the writing in this way of experiencing the world with a literate mind is an entrance into analytical thinking. This is not to say, according to Ong, and he's very careful about this is not to say that people in oral cultures cannot think. And I think that's really important to hang on to, because a number of people have interpreted this book to suggest that orality is somehow inferior to literacy, and that's absolutely not Ong's purpose or his point. His point is to say that there are different kinds of thinking in oral and in written cultures or chirographic cultures, and that each has an important value, and that in fact today and always, even if we want to convince ourselves otherwise, writing depends on, orality depends now on a kind of writing, and writing always, as he says in the beginning of the book, and I said at the beginning of this lecture, writing always includes orality or an oral features, even if we're not aware of it. So he's talking about how they, work almost, this is an overstatement, but they almost work dialectically. They almost work as if in conversation with one another. So there's the larger claims and the general definitions, all of which, again, all of this theoretical and historical information will begin to be much more clear when we get to the next lecture on Egyptian writing and then on ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform writing. So keep that in mind, these differences between thinking and the mentality of an oral culture as opposed to a written culture. The last thing that I would like simply to discuss in this short second part of the penultimate thing, there's something else, are some of the features of textuality, specifically of literacy. And these, I think, are quite helpful. Dynamics of textuality on page 101, they begin. And just to summarize them, you can look back through these later on. Some of the primary features of a textual or literate culture or way of thinking that specifically have to do with what it means to write something. There's first point that Ong makes is that written words are isolated from a fuller context in which spoken words come into being. So written words are isolated. They don't necessarily depend on, in order to be read in a given moment, they don't necessarily depend on context. We don't need the reader and the writer and the context, the actual lived historical moment actually there. Now, that's helpful and so on, and that's a larger discussion, but we don't have to have it there. We can actually read the words, and for the most part often make sense of them if we know the language that the words represent. So that's the first point. The second is that writing is solipsistic. Writing is done, this is an interesting claim, I think it's an arguable one, but the writing is done alone. And even if you're sitting in a computer room full of 2,000 other people, you still are writing alone. It's difficult to write as a group. I can tell you I've experienced it. It doesn't quite work. At least I don't think so. But hang on to that idea if you're thinking, well, yeah, but. So writing is something that happens alone. The third point Ong makes about the dynamics of textuality is that a text, texts, and I mentioned this last time, do not have their full phonetic qualities. That is to say, when we're reading something that's written, we're actually supplying some of the sounds that are not actually on the paper. We discussed this with the definition of a phoneme. We may not be aware of it, but for example, the letter P makes a number of different sounds depending on the word in which it appears. And so P is actually a kind of phoneme, a kind of name of a category of sounds that roughly fall into that, roughly sound something like the letter P. So the written word does not have, or written text do not express full phonetic qualities. We have to have a speaker there who knows the language, who can supply that lacking information. the phonetic information. Fourth point is that in another way, there's no extra textual context for the readers and for the writers. And this is kind of interesting. The readers and the writer, the author is not there. The author is actually not there when you're reading something, nor is a reader actually there when an author is writing something. So we have to, in Ong's terms, fictionalize each other. So we're looking to the text in order to figure out who we think this writer might have been, what he or she might have been like, and so on. And, you know, there's much discussion about whether or not we should be doing that at all when we read, but I think we kind of can't help doing that. We're always wondering what kind of personality or person is behind this writing. Just as an author, when he or she writes, is at least imagining some kind of audience. Even if one is writing for oneself is one's audience. So that's something that writing requires, a kind of fictionalization of the author and of the reader, which is an interesting point. And there are a number of ways in which there are paradoxes involved in a lot of what I'm saying, which is why Ong concludes on page 103 that writing is indeed the seedbed of irony. And we'll be discussing some of these paradoxes and ironies as we continue. The final point that I think is very, very important to remember is what Ong says roughly on page 81. Writing is a technology. Now, this is what I say on the homepage for this website, for this course. It's really important to remember that because, as we said last time, writing is something that is learned, and that is learned by means of using tools that are outside of our bodies, that are not us. When we're learning to speak, which is a natural process if we're surrounded by others who speak our language, we will learn to speak. Writing requires the use of tools, so it is a technology itself. It is a tool that we're using that also requires additional tools, such as, simply put, pens, pencils, today computers perhaps. But there's a kind of compounding of tools that are necessarily in order to create words in space, in order to make objects. So this is a really great idea, and I think these, it's just very, very important to think about that, to resist this idea that when we're writing something, it's something that purely is us or purely comes out of us, which writers of really great fiction and so on, really great poetry, of course, know is not true. The writing can, once it's out there, if we think of McLuhan, be understood as an extension of ourselves. We can understand it to be our little progeny out in the world in some way, but it's a progeny that we make. It's not a progeny that is just somehow birthed by us. So we invent it in a way that we don't invent the children to whom we give birth. They come out of us, but we don't invent it in the same way. There's a technology involved, and there's a deliberate act of creation involved in writing. So one that, again, puts our words into space in some kind of technical way that makes them permanent. So we have here, on page 82, Ong says, there is no way to write naturally. That's literally true. Writing can come to feel natural, but there's no way to actually write naturally. It is a technology, and we use tools to do so. So the important point here is that I think this is interesting for a number of reasons, but he continues to say that to say writing, this is at the bottom of page 82, to say that writing is artificial is not to condemn it, but to praise it. This is a really important point, and again, something that I think is overlooked in Long, actually, not misunderstood, but overlooked, that it is artificial is a good thing. It's something that we created. That's not a bad thing. Like other artificial creations, and indeed more than any other, he continues, It is utterly invaluable and indeed essential for the realization of fuller interior human potentials. Technologies are not mere exterior aids, they are not only that, but also interior transformations of consciousness, transformations of the way we think and understand ourselves in the world. So this is a really, really quite beautiful idea. So using something artificial can in fact pull out and develop human potentials. And we'll see how that's so, and we can think of lots of concrete examples of how that in fact that's really actually so. If we think of someone who needs a prosthetic device, there's absolutely nothing wrong with someone learning how to use a false leg. This person is not somehow dehumanized by using that false leg. The person is probably rehumanized in a way to the extent that this person can feel that that is an incorporated part of his or her natural body. So it's wonderful that there's this opportunity to rehumanize the body in a certain way, or to make it, give it the experience, to experience the body the way that one might have before. So that's a rough example, but there's certainly nothing wrong with that, and there's no reason to say I want to be natural and not to use this prosthetic device. So that would be what Ong would argue in that case. He continues to say that this technologies are valuable because, and to continue in this paragraph, writing heightens consciousness. It makes us more aware. Alienation from a natural milieu can be good for us. That is to say, having a perspective or having a reflective distance on what we take to be natural, or what in fact is natural, for example, our speaking, or our bodily functions, to have a sort of perspective on that, to be more aware of those processes is certainly not a bad thing. It can be good for us, and indeed is in many ways essential. It's essential for human life. To live and to understand fully, we need not only proximity but also distance. And that sums up proximity, closeness, continuity, harmony. That's associated with oral culture and an oral consciousness. We need that. That's not he's not devaluing that, but we also need distance. And if you think very practically, this makes very clear sense. So to see something well, we need to see it closely, and then we need to see it from a distance. We need to see it up front, and then right up close and personal, and then we need to understand what it looks like as a whole and within a larger scene. So the final example on which I'll close for this idea is on page 83. This is, excuse me, about halfway down the page. To achieve such expression, of course, we're talking about someone learning how to play music, which is, if you're using a tool especially, it's a technology in itself, and then it requires a certain kind of tool. The violinist or organist has to have interiorized the technology. You have to make it feel natural somehow. It's not natural, but you have to make it feel natural. You have to, in other words, extend your sense of what's natural, if we're using McLuhan's language. You must have interiorized the technology, made the tool or machine a second nature. A second nature, and that's what we mean when we say that. A psychological part of himself or herself. It feels mentally, intellectually to you like a part of your own body. This practice of your own body, this practicing with this instrument, feels or has come to feel natural. This calls for years of practice, learning how to make the tool do what it can do. Such shaping of a tool to oneself, learning a technological skill, is hardly dehumanizing. The use of a technology can enrich the human psyche, enlarge the human spirit, intensify its interior life. Writing is an even more deeply interiorized technology than instrumental music performances. But to understand what it is, we need to go back to orality. And we will be doing that very shortly. Next, however, in the next few lectures, we'll be discussing the concrete features and the historical reasons for the production of writing in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And then we will return to a study of orality and how these primarily oral cultures became chirographic or writing cultures. Thank you.